Ruth Calloway wore the same gray dress to her father's will, reading that she'd worn to his funeral. Of the 6 chairs set out in that office, hers was the only one no one had saved a seat beside. She sat down where the others left her. And then her own sister stood up, crossed the room, and slid Ruth's chair back against the far wall. "So the family can sit up front," Vivian said. She said it sweet. She said it loud enough for the room. Later, when Ruth raised one hand to speak, the family lawyer chuckled at her. "This is grown-up business, Ruthie," he said. "Why don't you go make the coffee?" 11 relatives laughed. 2 attorneys laughed with them. That's 13 grown people, laughing at a woman in a gray dress. And Ruth Calloway did not cry. She had something on her lap. A slim leather portfolio, resting under her folded hands, and not one soul in that room bothered to look at it. She opened it. 1 inch, just enough for her own eyes. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one find a soft place in you, subscribe and stay to the end, because the end is the whole point. And do me a small thing while you're here. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Ruth's story travels. Now, let me take you back and tell it the way it happened. Ruth Calloway was the one who stayed. The town was Delford, Ohio, and the year was 1971, and the spring that year came in slow and wet. The kind of spring that keeps the fields dark till May. Delford was a small place. 1 main street, 1 traffic light, a 5 and dime, a lumber yard, a hardware store with a bell on the door. And most of what a person could point to in that town, Harlan Calloway had built, or fixed, or sold to them across a counter. He'd started with 1 truck. That was the whole company at the beginning. 1 flatbed truck, a stack of pine, and a man who would drive lumber out to any farm at any hour, in any weather, and never once shortchange the load. From that truck came Calloway Lumber and Hardware. And from the store came the house on Cicero Street, white clapboard, green shutters, a porch that ran the whole front. And beyond the house lay 80 acres of bottomland, good black soil down along the creek, worth more every year as the town crept toward it. That was the estate. The store, the house, the 80 acres. Everything one hard man had made with his 2 hands. Harlan had 4 children, but only 3 of them counted the money, and only 1 of them counted him. There was Vivian, the eldest, 44 now, who had married up and married money and moved to a house in Columbus with a circle drive. There was Warren, 41, all charm and no ballast, who'd opened a car dealership on borrowed money and watched it sink. And there had been another son, gone young, whom nobody spoke of much. And there was Ruth, 38, plain, unmarried, the one who stayed. 2 years back, Harlan had a stroke. It came for him in the night, quiet as a thief, and by morning the whole right side of the man had gone still. His leg dragged, his face pulled. And his right hand, the hand that had signed 40 years of invoices, the hand that had built the store, that hand lay open on the sheet and would not close. The doctors at Delford General had a word for it. Right hemiplegia. Ruth had a plainer word, dead. His writing hand was dead, and it never came back. The flashy children came for the funeral of his health the way they'd later come for the funeral of the man. On holidays. Christmas, mostly, Vivian would sweep in with gifts nobody needed and be gone by the second morning. Warren would stand in the kitchen and talk about the store's value and never once carry a tray upstairs. Ruth moved home. She gave up her rented rooms above the diner and moved back into her girlhood bedroom on Cicero Street, and she nursed her father for 2 years. She drove him to Delford General on the bad mornings and sat in the hard chairs while they read his blood. She learned to feed a man who could not lift a spoon. She learned to read his mouth when the words came out crooked, to hear water in a sound that was barely a sound, to know from the set of his jaw when the pain was bad and he was too proud to say. At night, when he couldn't sleep, she read to him, and in the day she still went to work. Because a woman has to eat, and the store's money was the store's money, and Ruth would not touch it. So 5 days a week she stood behind the counter at Hessel's Five and Dime, ringing up thread and penny candy and mousetraps, and folks in town called her the Calloway girl. The plain one, the one who never married, and she'd smile and count their change and never let them see one thing that moved behind her eyes. That's who Ruth was. Remember her, because the rest of the family already thought they knew her, and they were about to find out they never knew her at all. Harlan died in February, on a gray afternoon, with his good hand in Ruth's hand, and the last thing he said meant only for her. The wake was held in the house on Cicero Street, and the family gathered, and Ruth watched them move through her father's rooms like people at an estate sale who'd arrived a little early. Vivian ran her eyes over the good furniture. Warren stood by the fireplace, and at one point Ruth saw him take a small white card from his breast pocket, look at it, and put it back. A business card. She didn't know whose. She would learn. "That store's dead weight," Vivian said in the kitchen, to no one and to everyone, drying a glass she hadn't washed. "Nobody buys lumber from a little shop like that anymore. The building, the land, that's the value. We sell the land and we're done." "We're not done till it's signed," Warren said. "It'll be signed," Vivian said. And she looked at Ruth, who was carrying a tray of cups the way she'd carried trays for 2 years, and Vivian smiled at her the way you smile at the hired help you mean to keep. "Ruthie, honey, you've done so much. You must be exhausted. When all this is settled, you should take a little trip somewhere." They had already decided what Ruth's place was. Her place was the tray. Her place was the sick room, now empty. Her place was gratitude for whatever they chose to leave her. They did not know about the books. Up in Ruth's bedroom, on a plain pine shelf her father had built her when she was a girl, stood a row of thick volumes. Dark spines. Heavy, and once, months before, Vivian had wandered in looking for a bathroom and seen them, and laughed out loud. "Good Lord, Ruthie. Are you still playing at that? Your little correspondence hobby?" She'd trailed one manicured finger along the spines without reading a single word on them. "You always did like to seem busy." She called it a hobby, and she moved on, and she never looked again. If she had looked, if she had tipped her head and read the gold letters worn soft on those cracked spines, she'd have seen that they were the Ohio Revised Code, the statutes of the state, volume after volume, and she'd have seen that they were not for show. The spines were broken from use. The pages were soft at the corners from a thumb that turned them late, and turned them often, and turned them for years. But Vivian didn't look. None of them ever did. That was the whole trouble with Ruth's family. They had decided long ago what she was, and a decision like that makes a person blind. The reading of the will was set for a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the funeral, in the offices of Byron Tuck, attorney at law, the man who had handled Harlan's affairs for 30 years. Nobody told Ruth. That's a small thing, and it isn't. She was the man's daughter. She was the one who'd nursed him to the end. And when the family sat down to arrange the reading of his last wishes, not one of them thought to lift a telephone and tell Ruth Calloway the date. She found out from the newspaper. There was a legal notice in the Delford Courier, the small print at the back that nobody reads, and Ruth read everything, and there it was. Estate of Harlan Calloway. The date. The time. The place. She cut it out with the kitchen scissors and set it on the table and looked at it a long while. There was one more thing that happened in those 3 weeks, and it happened in the front hall, and Warren saw it and drew exactly the wrong lesson from it. Ruth was hanging up her coat, and something slipped from the pocket and fell to the floorboards, and Warren bent and picked it up before she could. It was a bus ticket stub. Delford to Columbus, and under it another and another, a little fan of them held with a paper clip, every one of them a Tuesday. Warren looked at the stubs. Then he looked at his sister, and something like pity crossed his handsome face. "You going up to the city nights, Ruthie?" he said. "You cleaning offices up there or something?" He handed the stubs back, and he didn't wait for an answer, because he'd already given himself one. Poor Ruth. Scrubbing floors in Columbus after dark to make ends meet. It fit what he believed. It fit so well he never thought to ask. Ruth took the stubs back and slid them into her pocket. "Something like that," she said. 3 years. That's how long she'd been riding the Tuesday bus to Columbus. The last bus out and the late bus home, 90 minutes each way in the dark, with a book open on her knee under the little reading light. 3 years of night classes at the Capital Night Law School, the school for the ones who couldn't afford to stop working. The mill hands and the shop clerks and the tired mothers who wanted, badly, to be something the daytime world had told them they could never be. Ruth sat in those rooms after standing all day at Hessel's counter, and she learned the law of the state of Ohio, statute by statute, case by case, the same law that stood in cracked volumes on her girlhood shelf. She took her exams in the small hours, at the kitchen table, while her father slept upstairs. She'd study contracts with one ear tuned to the sound of him, ready to climb the stairs the second he called. And when he was gone, and the house went quiet in a way she'd never known it, she kept riding the bus. Because she was close now. So close. Warren thought she cleaned offices. Let him. She had a portfolio to prepare, and a Tuesday to get ready for, and she got ready in that particular Calloway silence that the whole family mistook for smallness. Tuesday came. Byron Tuck's office sat above the bank on Main Street, up a flight of stairs with a brass rail worn bright. Inside, it was all dark wood and green shades and the smell of pipe smoke gone stale in the drapes. Tuck had set out chairs, he'd set out coffee. He'd arranged the room the way a man arranges a stage, and when the Calloways came up the stairs, he met each of them at the door and greeted them by name. "Dr. Reed," he said, to Vivian's husband, bowing a little. "Mrs. Reed, Warren, my boy, good to see you. Aunt Cora, cousin. All of them by name, all of them by title, all of them shown to the good chairs up front, and then Ruth came up the stairs, in the gray dress, with the slim leather portfolio held flat against her. "And this," said Byron Tuck, and he smiled at her, warm as pie, "is the girl who kept house. Ruth, isn't it? So good of you to come, dear. There's coffee, if you'd freshen the pot." That was when Vivian rose and moved Ruth's chair to the back wall so the family could sit up front, and Ruth carried herself to the back of the room and sat down alone with 11 relatives and 2 lawyers arranged in front of her like a jury that had already made up its mind. Nobody noticed the portfolio. And nobody at all, noticed the pen. Clipped inside the leather, along the spine, was a fountain pen. Black, plain, a little worn at the cap. It had been Harlan Calloway's pen. He'd carried it 40 years, signed every invoice with it, and when Ruth was a small girl he'd sat her at the kitchen table and closed her little hand around it and taught her to make her letters. Press and lift. Press and lift. That's a girl's first cursive, in her father's black ink. Ruth had that pen now. She'd taken it from his desk the day he died, and it rode inside her portfolio, over her heart, and not one person in that room knew it was there, or would have cared if they did. Byron Tuck settled behind his big desk. He put on his glasses. He shuffled his papers square, and he cleared his throat, and he began to read the last will and testament of Harlan Calloway. He read the early parts slow and smooth, the small bequests. A watch to a nephew, a sum to the church. And then he came to a page he handled more carefully than the rest, and his voice changed just slightly, and he said, "Now, there is a codicil. An amendment, dated 8 months ago, which your father executed in this very office. And it revises the distribution of the principal estate." The room went still. In recognition of their sound business judgment, Tuck Reed, and their proven capacity to steward the family enterprise, I leave and bequeath the Calloway Lumber and Hardware business, together with the real property of the store, and the 80 acres of bottomland described herein, to my daughter Vivian and my son Warren, in equal share. Vivian's chin lifted. Warren let out a slow breath. To my daughter Ruth, Tuck read on, and here his voice softened. The way a voice softens over the small and the pitiable, in gratitude for her care, I leave my fountain pen, the family Bible, and the sum of $500. $500. A pen. A Bible. 2 years of nursing. 3 weeks of a father's death held in her 2 hands, and the man who built the town had signed it all away to the 2 children who came at Christmas, signed it, so the paper said, 8 months back, in this office, in Byron Tuck's careful keeping. Ruth stood up. She didn't say much. She raised her hand, the way you'd raise your hand in a schoolroom, and she started to say, "I'd like to." And Byron Tuck laughed at her. He set down the paper, and he took off his glasses, and he laughed, an easy, indulgent, public laugh, and he said, "This is grown-up business. Ruthie, why don't you go make the coffee?" And the room laughed with him. 11 relatives. 2 attorneys. They laughed. Not cruel, most of them. That was almost the worst of it. They laughed the way you laugh at a child who's wandered into the adult's conversation, fond and dismissive all at once, and the sound of it filled that little office. And Ruth Calloway stood at the back wall in her gray dress, alone, with her father's pen over her heart and 80 acres slipping away in front of her, and she did not cry. She waited. She let the laughter run itself out, the way you let a wave run up the sand and back, and when it was quiet again, she sat back down. "Well," said Byron Tuck, pleased, putting his glasses back on, "if we're all settled, there are acceptance forms to sign, and then we needn't take up any more of anyone's afternoon." He passed the forms out to the front row. Vivian took hers with a little flourish. Warren was already reaching into his coat for a pen. And then Tuck slid a paper down the side of the room toward the back, toward Ruth, and Vivian turned and pushed it the last few inches across to her, and Vivian said, "Kind as poison. Here you go, Ruthie. Just make your mark at the bottom, honey. An X is fine if you like. Just make your mark. An X is fine." Ruth looked at the paper. Then she looked up, and her voice was very quiet and very even, and she said, "Mr. Tuck, before I sign anything, might I see the codicil? Just for a moment." Byron Tuck smiled. It cost him nothing, and it looked generous, and he was a man who liked to look generous in front of a room. "Of course, dear," he said. "Of course you may look at it." He held the single page out across the desk, between 2 fingers, the way you'd hand a picture book to a child. "Take your time." Ruth crossed to the desk and took it, and she read it the way no one else in that room had ever read a legal document in their lives. She didn't skim for her own name. She didn't hunt for the number. She read it from the top. The heading. The recitals, every clause in order, her eyes moving steady and slow, down through the body of the thing, and then, and this is what gave her away, if anyone had known what they were watching, she did not stop at the end of the bequests. She read on, down to the part nobody reads. The attestation clause, where the witnesses swear what they saw, and below that, the notary block, where Byron Tuck himself had signed and stamped and sworn that Harlan Calloway had appeared before him, and signed this document of his own free hand. Her thumb moved down the page. And it stopped. Twice. Once on the date. And once on the signature at the bottom, Harlan Calloway, written out bold and firm, the letters leaning hard to the right, pressed deep and confident into the paper the way a strong man signs. A man who has signed his name 10,000 times and never once had to think about it. A bold, right-slanting, confident signature. Ruth looked at it a long moment. Her face did not change. But something in the room began, very quietly, to change, though no one up front could have said what. Byron Tuck felt it. Lawyers feel a room. He reached out his hand across the desk. "All right, dear, that's enough now. Let me have it back, and we'll get everyone signed and on their way." He wiggled his fingers for the page. "Come along." And Warren, from the front row, twisting around in his chair, said the thing that was meant to end it. Said it flat and tired and final, the way you'd speak to a dog that wouldn't settle. "Sit down, Ruthie." That was the moment. That was the door swinging shut. Tuck's hand out for the page. Warren telling her to sit. Vivian already uncapping a pen for her own signature. 11 relatives shifting in their chairs, ready to be done, ready to go home, the whole thing a formality now. The land as good as sold. The plain sister as good as handled. Ruth did not sit down. She did not raise her voice. She did not clutch the paper to her chest or make a speech about fairness or their father or the 2 years she'd given. She stood at the edge of Byron Tuck's big desk, in her gray dress, holding the codicil in one steady hand, and she asked one question. A plain question, a flat, simple question, the kind you might ask about the weather. "Mr. Tuck," she said, "on what date did our father lose the use of his right hand?" And the room went silent. Not the polite silence of a moment before. A different silence. The silence of a thing that has been said out loud that cannot be taken back, though not one person in that office yet understood what it was. Byron Tuck's hand was still out across the desk, fingers open for a page that wasn't coming. Vivian's pen had stopped above her form. Warren had turned all the way around now. Ruth Calloway stood among the people who had laughed at her, holding a forged piece of paper in her father's building. And she waited, calm as still water, for someone to answer a question she already knew the answer to. Knew it to the day, knew it to the hour, had lived it in a hospital corridor 2 years before, with her father's dead hand open in her own. She had not made a speech. She had asked a question. And a question, if it is the right question, is a door you cannot close again. Byron Tuck let his hand drop. He did it slowly, the way a man does when he is deciding, in real time, how to handle something he did not expect. He pulled his fingers back and set them flat on the desk in front of him, and he looked at Ruth Calloway the way you look at something that has just moved when you were certain it couldn't. Then he smiled. "Ruth," he said it gently, the way you gentle a misunderstanding. "Your father suffered his stroke in March of last year. That's a matter of medical record. Now the codicil is dated August. That's a full 5 months after he'd recovered sufficient function to. He never recovered function in his right hand." She said it without raising her voice. Not partial function. Not temporary. Not on the good days. The right hemiplegia was permanent. I drove him to Delford General every Tuesday for 16 months. I sat in that waiting room with his good hand in mine. There were no good days for the right. Vivian set her pen down. Not noisily. Quietly, which was worse. This is not the place for family grievances about who visited how often. Her voice had gone smooth and careful, the way it went when she was managing a situation she had not yet lost. The medical questions, if there are medical questions, belong in front of a probate judge. "Byron, can we proceed?" "We can," Tuck said, and reached for the codicil again. Ruth did not let go of it. A beat. Just a beat. The two of them with a hand on the same page across a mahogany desk in a room full of relatives who were beginning to understand, each at their own speed. that something was happening here that they hadn't planned for. Then Ruth reached into the portfolio with her free hand and set a second sheet on the desk beside the first. She set it the way you set down evidence. Flat, centered, turned, so the text faced Tuck and the register and anyone else who cared to read it. It was a hospital discharge summary. Delford General, March 9, 1970. Harlan James Calloway, 62 years. Diagnosis: right hemisphere ischemic stroke. Right-sided hemiplegia, upper extremity, confirmed permanent. Unable to sign. Left-hand mark affixed to discharge authorization, witnessed by attending physician. March 9th. The codicil in Tuck's other hand was dated August 4th. Ruth did not point to the dates. She did not need to. She simply left the two documents on the desk side by side and waited while every person in that room did the arithmetic they had been hoping not to do. Warren was the first to try something. Papers get misdated. Secretaries make errors. It's a clerical, the attestation clause, Ruth said, is on page 2. It reads, and I am quoting directly, witnessed this 4th day of August, 1970, as the testator signed his name in our presence. His name. His signature. Present tense, active, observed, she looked at Tuck. Your notary swears he watched Harlan Calloway sign this document with a hand that the hospital had already declared permanently paralyzed 5 months prior. The room was quiet the way a room gets when nobody wants to be the one to speak. One of the cousins in the back row, a thin woman named Gerta, who had not said a word all morning, had stopped pretending to look at her purse clasp and was staring at the desk. A second cousin's chair made a small sound against the floor. Not moving, just shifting weight. Byron Tuck's color had changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But Ruth had watched her father's face through 2 years of small collapses, and she knew what color looked like when it left a man slowly. Tuck's jaw was still set. His posture was still the posture of a man in command of his own office. But something behind his eyes had changed the way a river changes when you dam it, the pressure rerouting itself somewhere. Building somewhere it couldn't be seen yet. I'm going to stop this, he said. We're going to stop this right here, and any challenges to the instrument are going to be filed in the proper venue with proper counsel. I am proper counsel. She opened the portfolio fully. She had not opened it like this before. She had let the portfolio sit on her lap all morning, slim and unremarkable. The kind of thing a plain woman carries to a formal occasion, so she has somewhere to put her hands. Now she laid it open on the near edge of the desk and withdrew a single document and placed it beside the discharge summary and the codicil, the 3 pages in a row like arguments in a brief. The document was her certificate of admission to the Ohio bar. State seal at the top, the Supreme Court's signature, her name typed in clean block letters across the center. Ruth Ann Calloway. Admitted to the practice of law in the state of Ohio. Dated 4 months prior. Nobody spoke. Vivian made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the sound a person makes when the floor has shifted under them and they have not yet decided whether to fall or grab for something. Her eyes went from the certificate to Ruth's face and back, as if one of the two things would turn out to be wrong if she looked at it long enough. Warren said, "You," and stopped. "I took the night bus to Columbus," Ruth said, and her voice was the same voice she'd used all morning, level and unhurried, with nothing in it that looked like triumph. Tuesdays, 3 years. Capital Night Law School. I sat for the bar in February, and I was sworn in at the State House in April. There was no one there to see it. A pause, short as a breath. Dad was in hospital that week, so I went alone. Tuck's hand had found the edge of his desk. His fingers were pressed flat against the wood, the way you press your hand against something solid when the room has tilted. He was looking at Ruth Calloway, the plain sister, the shop girl, the one who made the coffee, and she could see him doing the thing she had watched him do all morning, only in reverse, reassessing, recalculating, running back through every decision in the last 8 months and finding, at each one, the assumption he'd made that had just come apart. He had assumed the only lawyer in the room was himself. The register, who had been sitting to the left of Tuck's desk all morning with a filing log across his knees and the mild, patient expression of a man used to waiting for other people's business to conclude, was now very still. His pen had not moved in some time. He was watching Ruth with an attention that had nothing mild in it anymore. Tuck gathered himself. Ruth could see him do it, spine straightening, voice descending back toward the register of authority. He was going to make a motion. He was going to call for an adjournment, cite procedure, cite the need for verification, cite anything that bought him a closed door and a phone and time to consider what he had stepped into. She had known he would try this. She had planned for it the way you plan for weather, not with anger, not with a countermove waiting like a trap, but simply by having already done the thing he would now need time to undo. Her hand went back into the portfolio. Her hand went back into the portfolio, and the room forgot how to breathe. She did not hurry. That was the thing they would remember later, the ones who told it at kitchen tables for years after. She did not hurry. Ruth Calloway had spent 2 years learning the pace of a man whose right side would not answer, learning to wait for the word he was trying to say, learning that the fastest way through a hard thing was to slow down and do it once. Correctly, she moved the same way now. Unhurried, certain, she drew out a single folded sheet, and she set it on Byron Tuck's desk beside the discharge summary and beside her bar certificate. 3 pages now, laid in a neat row on the man's own blotter. She smoothed the fold flat with 2 fingers. "Before I came here this morning," she said, "I stopped at the courthouse." Tuck's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. "I filed a formal challenge to this codicil. It's entered. It's on the docket. It has a number." She looked up, and her plain face was very calm. "I didn't come to this reading to ask you for anything, Mr. Tuck. I came because a challenge is heard on the record, and the record is here, in this room, with these witnesses. I wanted it heard where it happened." The register had set his filing log down on the floor beside his chair. He was leaning forward now, both forearms on his knees. Harlan. That was his name. Ruth had shaken his hand at 8 that morning across a counter that smelled of ink and floor wax, and he had stamped her petition, and he had said, mild as milk, that he'd be at the Tuck reading later on other business, small world. He did not look mild now. He looked like a man who had walked into a barn expecting hay and found a fire. "May I see that?" Harlan said. It was not a question. Ruth turned the filed sheet so it faced him and slid it across. Warren found his voice first, because Warren always did. This is theater," he said, and he laughed, but the laugh came out wrong, thin at the edges, a laugh that hurt itself and didn't like the sound. "Ruthie, honestly, you rode a bus. You took some classes. That doesn't make you, on what date?" Ruth said, "Did our father lose the use of his right hand?" She had asked it once already, and he had ducked it. She asked it again, flat, into the middle of him. Warren stopped. "You were at the funeral," Ruth went on. "You know when the stroke was. It was March of last year. The 9th. I drove him to Delford General at 4 in the morning in the flatbed because his car was too low to lift him into. I sat with him for 11 days. When he came home, his right arm lay in his lap like something that belonged to another man. He never signed his name again. Not once. Not a check. Not a card. Not a letter. His right hand was dead 5 months before the day written on that codicil. The word dead landed in the room and stayed there. Vivian shifted in the front row. She was 44, and she wore her age the way she wore everything, expensively and against the grain, and for the first time all morning her chin had come down from its angle. "The medical business," she said, "is not relevant to. It's the only thing that's relevant." Ruth didn't raise her voice. She had learned, at the Five and Dime, that you don't shout across a counter, you speak once, plainly, and let the customer lean in. The whole room was leaning in now. "Read the attestation, Mr. Tuck. Read it out loud. It says the testator signed in your presence and in the presence of the register whose seal is on the page. It gives the date. August the 4th, 1970. She touched the discharge summary. This is Delford General. March the 9th, 1970. Right hemiplegia. In the doctor's own hand, 3 words, unable to sign. 5 months before your notary swears he watched my father put pen to paper, a physician wrote that my father could not hold a pen. She let that sit. Then she reached across and turned the codicil itself so it faced the room, and she put one finger on the signature. "Look at it," she said. "Everyone here who knew him, look at it. That's a strong hand. Right slanted, bold at the downstroke. That's the signature of a man leaning into the page. My father wrote like that his whole life, right-handed, before March of last year." Her finger did not move. "A dead hand does not write, Mr. Tuck. It doesn't slant bold to the right. It doesn't lean into anything. Whoever moved that pen across that line, and somebody did, somebody sat at a desk and practiced it, it was not my father. It could not have been. He was in the front bedroom on Cicero Street with his right arm in his lap, and I was feeding him supper with a spoon." Nobody laughed now. 13 grown people had laughed at her 40 minutes ago. 11 relatives and 2 attorneys. She had counted them without meaning to, the way you count stairs in the dark. And now the same 13 sat in a silence so complete she could hear the traffic light change out on the one main street of Delford, the soft mechanical clunk of it, turning green over an empty crossing. "There's more," Ruth said. "One more thing, and then I'm finished, and then Mr. Harlan can do his job." She had planned this part last, and smallest, because it was the flaw an amateur would miss and a careful reader would not, and she wanted them to see that she was a careful reader. "The account reference," she said. Second paragraph, where the codicil directs the cash bequest. It names the bank. First, Delford Savings and Trust. She looked at Byron Tuck, and something in her face was almost gentle, which was worse than anger. There was no First Delford Savings and Trust last August. There was Delford Savings, and there was the Farmers' Trust 2 doors down, and they did not merge and take that joint name until this past autumn. I know the date because I banked my father's grocery money there every Friday for 2 years, and I watched them change the sign. A document supposedly signed in August of 1970 names a bank that would not exist for another 14 months. She straightened. The dead hand tells you it's forged. The bank name tells you who wrote it and when. Somebody working from paper that was on their own desk this year, not last. Byron Tuck came up out of his chair. He was 57 years old, and he had been the most powerful man in any Delford room he entered for 30 of those years. And he came up fast, reaching, his hand going for the 3 pages on his blotter as though he could gather them back into not existing. "This proceeding is adjourned," he said, loud, too loud. "These documents are. There's a clerical matter here, an error in preparation I'll not have. Give me those." His hand closed on air. The pages were gone. Register Harlan had them. He had stood. Ruth hadn't quite seen him do it. He was simply on his feet now, all 6 patient feet of him. And he had swept the codicil and the discharge summary and the filed challenge into a single stack against his chest, and he stepped back 1 clean pace from Tuck's reaching hand and put the desk corner between them. "Mr. Tuck," Harlan said. "Sit down." Warren had half risen too, out of instinct, out of that animal sense a cornered man has, that the room is moving, and he ought to move with it. "Now hold on," Warren started. "Hold." "Everyone will sit down," Harlan said. And he did not shout it either, and that was why it worked. He was the Register of Wills for the county. He had presided over 400 readings in that chair and buried the estates of half the families in 3 townships, and when he set his voice down flat on a room, the room obeyed the way water obeys a slope. "I am taking custody of these instruments, all 3. Mr. Tuck, I'm going to want your notary log, and I'm going to want your commission, and I'm going to want them today, before I leave this office. Sit down." Byron Tuck sat down. He sat because his legs had stopped believing in him. Ruth watched it happen. She had watched him all morning do a thing to her, reassess, recalculate, revise the small woman in the gray dress downward and downward until she was nearly nothing, and she watched the whole machinery of it run now in reverse and eat him alive. The color went out of his face in a way she had only seen once before, at a bedside, in a man the hour before he died. His hand came to rest on the desk. On the blotter sat his own fountain pen, a good one, marbled green, the pen of a prosperous man. He reached for it the way you reach for something familiar when the ground moves. He picked it up. His hand was shaking so badly the pen tapped against the wood. Tap, 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 small and awful in the quiet. He set it down again. "Byron," Vivian said, from the front row, and her voice had gone high and careful. "Byron, tell them. Tell them it's a mix-up. Tell them." Tuck did not tell them anything. Tuck was looking at the middle distance and seeing, Ruth thought, the County Review Board, and the State Bar, and 30 years turning to smoke. He had assumed the only lawyer in the room was himself. He had built a forgery on that one assumption, and never checked it, never once looked at the plain sister long enough to wonder what she carried in the slim leather portfolio on her lap. And the assumption had been wrong from the moment she walked in, and now it was going to cost him everything a man like him has. Register Harlan set the 3 pages on the head of Byron Tuck's own table. At the place where Tuck had sat all morning to read the fraud into the record, and he stood over them, and he read the 2 dates aloud to the room. Discharge summary. Delford General. March 9th, 1970. Right hemiplegia. Unable to sign. He turned the page. Codicil, dated, attested, and notarized. August 4th, 1970. He looked up over the top of his glasses at the 11 relatives who had laughed. 5 months apart. And a bank name that postdates the document by better than a year. He set the codicil down. On its face, in front of every one of you, this instrument is void. I'm referring it, the notary block, and Mr. Tuck's commission to the county this afternoon. Nobody signs anything today. Nobody's marking any acceptance forms. His eye found Vivian's hand, which still rested on the little stack of acceptance papers she had pushed at Ruth an hour ago. Those go in the stove, or they go in my file. Not on a table. Vivian took her hand off the papers. Ruth stood at the back wall where they had put her, where Vivian had slid her chair that morning so the family could sit up front. And she watched the 3 faces she had known her whole life come apart one at a time, and she felt no triumph in it. That surprised her. She had thought she might. She had ridden the Tuesday bus to Columbus for 3 years, imagining a version of this morning, and in the imagining there had been something hot and good in her chest. Something like winning. There was no winning in her chest now. There was only a great tiredness, and under it, way down, something quieter and older, her father's voice, mumbled and lopsided, from the front bedroom, saying the thing he had said to her 100 times in those 2 years. Tell the truth, Ruthie, even to the ones who won't like it. Especially to them. She was telling it. She let that be enough. Byron Tuck went first, because his fall was the cleanest and the law had the shortest road to it. He gathered himself one last time. "I want it on the record," he said, and his voice had gone quiet and formal, a drowning man reaching for procedure, that I had no personal knowledge. "You notarized it, Byron," Harlan said, not unkindly. "Your seal. Your signature under the attestation. You swore you watched a dead man's hand sign a name in bold right slant. You'll say all the rest of it to the board." He slid Tuck's own notary log across the desk toward him, the ledger book Tuck kept in the top drawer, and tapped it once. "Open it to August. Let's you and I look at the 4th together, right now, while the room's here to see." Tuck did not open it. He put his hand flat on the closed cover and he left it there, and his silence was its own confession, and every soul in the office understood it as one. Warren was next, and Warren broke differently, because Warren had never once in his 41 years believed that paper couldn't be worked around. He had borrowed on paper and buried a car dealership under paper, and he carried, that very morning, in the breast pocket of his good suit, a small white business card. A buyer's card, a man in Columbus who wanted 80 acres of Delford bottomland at a price, and wanted it fast. Ruth had seen the corner of it at the wake, white against the black wool, and she had known what it was, and she had said nothing. Warren's hand went to the pocket now. An old reflex. He touched the card through the cloth, and then he took his hand away as if it had burned him. Because the card was worth exactly nothing now, a promise to sell land that was not going to be his to sell. "Ruthie," he turned in his chair. He had gone gray under his good tan. "Ruth, the real one, the will before this, the equal split, that I still get." He couldn't finish it. He was asking his little sister, in front of 11 relatives, whether he still got anything. Ruth looked at him for a moment. She had loved Warren once, easily, the way you love a big brother who is charming at the supper table and gone by the time the dishes need doing. There was still a thread of it in her, worn thin but there. "Father's true will," she said, "divides everything in 6. The way he always meant it, before somebody sat down at a desk and improved on him." Her voice stayed even. There was no knife in it. That was the cruelest thing she could have done, and she did not do it. "You were never cut out, Warren, not by him. You'll take your 6th, same as everyone. You only believed a piece of paper that somebody forged for you. And you believed it because it gave you what you wanted, and you didn't look at the date any more than you ever looked at me." Warren put his face in his hands. Vivian was last, and Vivian was last because Vivian was the proudest, and pride is the slowest thing in any room to understand that it has lost. She had spent the whole morning certain the way only the comfortable can be, that a shop girl could not read a legal document, that the plain sister was furniture, that the estate would be closed, and the acreage sold, and the whole tired business of their father put behind them by lunch. She sat in the front row in a suit that cost more than Ruth made at Hessel's in 3 months, and she looked around at the silent relatives, at her husband Dr. Reed, gone stiff and pale beside her, at Byron Tuck, with his hand flat on a ledger he wouldn't open. And Ruth watched her reach for the one tool she had left. "Well," Vivian said, and she produced a smile, a bright social smile, the smile she used on people she wanted to manage. This is obviously a terrible misunderstanding among family. Byron's clearly made some clerical error, and we'll sort it privately, won't we? There's no need for all this in front of." She waved a gloved hand at the room, at the register, at the awful public daylight of it. "There's no need to make it a spectacle. Ruth, dear, surely you don't want to embarrass the family." And Ruth Calloway smiled back at her sister. It was a real smile, and a tired one, and it was the plainest thing in a plain woman's plain face. She walked to the back wall. She put her hands on her own chair, the wooden chair with the cracked seat that Vivian had slid to the back that morning so the family could sit up front, and she carried it, unhurried, up the center of the office. She set it down at the front, at the head of the table, beside the register. She smoothed her gray dress under her, the same gray dress she had worn to the funeral, the only dress no one had saved a seat beside. She sat. "Then you'll have no objection," Ruth said to her sister, from the front now, from up high, to reading the real one aloud. Vivian's smile faltered. "The real one, Father's true will." Ruth reached into the slim leather portfolio one last time, and every eye in the room followed her hand. The one he made after the stroke, when he knew his right hand was gone and his time was short. And he wanted it done right so that nobody could do to any of us exactly what somebody tried to do here today. She drew out the last document. It was not typed. It was ink on plain paper, and the ink was uneven. The letters formed slow and careful and slightly wrong, the way a right-handed man writes when he has taught himself, at 68, dying, to write all over again with his left. "He dictated it to me over 4 evenings," Ruth said. "In the front bedroom. I wrote the body of it in my hand, and then he signed it in his left, because it was the only one he had. It took him most of an hour to make his name. I've never watched anything braver. His nurse from Delford General was there, and Pastor Voss came out from First Methodist, and they both witnessed it and signed it. And they're both alive, and they're both in this county, and Mr. Harlan can have them here by this afternoon if anyone in this room would like to test it." She unfolded it on the table. "It leaves the store, Calloway Lumber and Hardware, that he built off one flatbed truck, to whichever of his children kept it running. Not sold. Run," she looked at Warren, who did not look up. "And it leaves the house on Cicero Street to, his words, I wrote them down as he said them. The one who stayed." Her voice did not break. She had promised herself it would not, and it did not. "The 80 acres divide in 6, the store to the child who works it, the house to the one who stayed. Everything else, in 6 equal parts, because he loved all 4 of us, even the ones who came on holidays, even the ones who called his life's work dead weight." She set her hand flat on the page, over her father's slow left-handed name. "I didn't scheme this, Vivian. I want you to understand that, because you'll tell it wrong for years if you don't. I didn't lie in wait. I didn't set a trap. I nursed our father, and I went to school on a bus at night while he slept. And I kept the truth in a folder on my lap, and I waited to see whether anyone in this family would tell it if I didn't." She looked around the room, at all 13 of the ones who had laughed. Nobody did. So I did. That's the whole of it. There was never anything here but the truth. You just none of you looked at what I was reading. In the back row, a thin cousin named Gerta, who had sat silent the entire morning, who had not laughed with the others, who had watched the desk all this time with an old woman's patient eyes, put her hand over her mouth, and above it her eyes were shining, and she was the first person in that office in a very long time to look at Ruth Calloway and see all the way to the bottom of her. Register Harlan took the holograph will and read it, top to bottom, the attestation, the witnesses' names. He set it down gently, the way you set down something that cost a dying man an hour of his last strength. "This," he said, "I'll admit to probate. The other one goes to the county with Mr. Tuck's commission." He capped his pen. "We're adjourned. Nobody signs. Nobody sells. Nothing moves until this is clean." And it was over, in the way these things are over, not with a gavel, not with a shout, but with the small dry sounds of a room emptying. Chairs scraping. Coats gathered. Dr. Reed steering Vivian out by the elbow, Vivian's face a careful blank, her gloves very white against her husband's dark sleeve. Warren going last, alone, the buyer's card still in his breast pocket like a stone he couldn't work out how to set down. Byron Tuck did not leave. Byron Tuck sat at his own desk with his hand on a ledger he would not open, waiting for a register of wills to come back for his commission. And Ruth thought, as she passed him, that he looked less like a lion now and more like the empty chair he'd made her sit in, a thing at the back of a room that nobody would save a seat beside ever again. She stopped at the door. She had one more thing to carry. She went back to Tuck's desk, past the man himself, and she picked up the codicil. No, she left the codicil. That was Harmon's now. That was evidence. She picked up instead the small black fountain pen that had lain in her portfolio all morning, clipped inside over her heart. Her father's pen. Plain black, worn pale at the cap, where a thumb had rubbed it smooth over 40 years of receipts and orders and a little girl's first shaky letters at a kitchen table on Cicero Street. Hold it light, Ruthie. Let it do the work. She had been 6. He had been young and whole and impatient and kind, and he had folded his big right hand over her small one and taught her to write her name. That pen. Not the pen the forger had used. His. She clipped it back inside the portfolio, over her heart, and she carried it home. The autumn came on the way it does in that part of Ohio, all at once and then not, cold in the mornings and gold by noon. The bottomland going brown and the maples along the one main street turning the color of the fire in a lit lamp. 6 months, near enough, from the morning in Byron Tuck's office to the morning I want to leave you with. Calloway Lumber and Hardware was open. You could smell it from the sidewalk, sawdust and cut pine, and the cold iron smell of nails in an open bin. The smell Harlan Calloway had lived inside for 40 years. The smell his youngest daughter had grown up thinking was just the smell of her father. The door had a bell on it that rang when you came in. It rang a good deal that autumn. The town had made a point of it. They came for a pound of finish nails they didn't need, and a length of stovepipe they'd get to next spring, and they came, if you want the truth of it, to shake the hand of the plain woman who had stood up at the back wall of a lawyer's office and told the truth to 13 people who laughed, and won. On the door, beside her father's old painted name, there was a second sign. Small, newly lettered, black on cream, no bigger than it needed to be. It said, R. Calloway, Attorney at Law. By appointment. She kept the store for the town, because the town needed a lumber yard and a place to buy a hinge, and because her father had built it off one flatbed truck, and she was not going to be the child who let it close. She ran it in the front. In the back office, where Harlan had once done his books, she hung her shingle and read the Ohio Revised Code, the same thick, cracked spine volumes that had sat on her bedroom shelf on Cicero Street while her sister laughed and called it her correspondence hobby, and she did the small legal work of a small town. Deeds, wills, real ones, witnessed properly, signed in the hand a person actually had. On the desk, capped, retired, honored, sat the black fountain pen. She did not write with it. She had a good steel nib pen for the day's work, and she used that. The black one just sat there, worn pale at the cap, in the light from the window, and now and then a client would ask about it, and she would say only that it had been her father's, that he had taught her to write with it. And she would not say the rest. The rest was hers. Byron Tuck's commission was under review by the county the last anyone heard, and there was talk the state bar would want its own long look, and he did not practice law in Delford anymore. His office on the main street had a paper in the window through the summer, and by fall the paper was gone, and so was the office. And a man from the lumber yard said he'd seen Tuck's marbled green fountain pen for sale in the case at the 5 and Dime where Ruth used to clerk, second hand, and nobody bought it. Warren sold his house. Not the store. The store was never his to sell, and he understood that now the way you understand a thing that has cost you. He sold his own house to his own creditors to cover what the failed dealership had buried him under, and he took his 1/6 of the 80 acres, same as everyone, same as their father had always meant, and once that autumn he came into the store for a box of screws, and he and Ruth stood at the counter a minute and did not say much, and it was not warm, exactly, but it was not nothing. And he took his hat off to her going out the door, which he had never once done before in her life. Vivian sent a Christmas card. It was expensive, and it was signed by all the Reeds in Vivian's beautiful hand, and it said, in the printed way those cards do, peace and joy. And it said nothing else, and Ruth answered it politely. A plain card in a plain envelope. Because there was no profit in doing otherwise, and because their father had loved all four of them, even the ones who came on holidays. They were not close. They were never going to be close. But Ruth had won the thing worth winning, which was the truth, and she found she had no appetite left over for winning the smaller things. She stayed. She had always been the one who stayed. In the evenings she locked the front, and she turned off the light over the nail bins. And she went back to the little office and sat a while before she went home to the house on Cicero Street that was hers now. The house where the front bedroom was empty and clean, and the whole place still smelled faintly, if you knew to look for it, of a man who had lived there and died there and been told the truth to the end. They had looked at Ruth Calloway her whole life and seen a plain woman in a gray dress. The shop girl. The one who made the coffee. The one whose chair you could slide to the back wall because she would not make a fuss. They looked at her for 38 years and never once, not one of them, looked at what she was reading. Her father had. Her father, near the end, when he could barely make his mouth say the words, had looked at his youngest and seen all the way to the bottom, and he had trusted her with the truth, and she had kept it, and she had spent it well. That's the whole of it. That's Ruth. If her story reached you tonight, if you've ever been the one who stayed, the one nobody saved a seat beside, the one they looked right past, then do me one small thing. Tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Ruth Calloway travels.